This week's budget speech is unlikely to bring any relief to long-suffering individual taxpayers. And with economic growth projections of nearly 1% this year, tax experts have warned that the country's fiscus is not yet out of the woods. But government is expected to apply the inflationary increases to the bracket creep to try and appease workers. So let's get analysis. For this, we're going to be joined by teams by Professor Waldo Krugell, an economist at the Faculty of Economic and Management Sciences at the Northwest University. Prof. Waldo, good afternoon and thanks for your time in the SABC at this hour.
Good afternoon and thanks for the opportunity.
Prof, let's start with news coming in earlier on. Almost 8 million South Africans now unemployed. And we know that an amount of 18.4 billion rand is allocated in the 2022, 2023 and the 23 and 2024 financial years to support youth employment and the creation of short-term jobs. I mean, as things stand currently, can government continue with its spending plans?
I think it can continue with some of its spending plans, but a lot of it is under pressure. And we already saw some of that last year when the minister in the mini budget said there's no money left. And government departments really need to cut back on spending across the board. And the impact of that has been the recent crisis of provinces not being able to appoint doctors, for example. So I think the minister is up for some hard choices. He has to choose between, say, healthcare services and these youth employment initiatives as examples. He has to choose between a whole range of different spending options.
Well, speaking of which, we're obviously playing with an imaginary crystal ball at this point because that speech is happening tomorrow. But what do you think the Minister of Finance should be dealing with as a matter of urgency as we speak?
I think his main job is to convince ratings agencies and the investors in our public debt that he's still on a sustainable path, even though he's facing some headwinds in terms of tax collection because the economy is growing slowly. And there's a lot of pressure for spending, but he's still committed to fiscal discipline. I think if he can achieve that, he'll be able to give it a go for another year. Along with that, of course, you'll be talking about spending reductions. And ideally, we would like to see that happening in a very systematic way. No ad hoc cutting of spending that could result in worse service delivery. We'd rather see bureaucracies being trimmed down, maybe programs and departments consolidated, those sorts of things to consolidate spending in the next 2 to 3 years.
Well, speaking of spending reductions, I mean, there's a focus on SOEs and questions about bailouts. What do you predict on that front as well?
I think he almost has no choice. Transnet has become too big to fail in many regards, and he has to give them some sort of bailout to keep going. But maybe the sort of services that Transnet deliver can also be sensibly provided by private sector participation. So he should make whatever bailout he gives them crowding in the private sector in the year to come. He can set some deadlines and make sure that there's progress on the reforms that he has in mind.
Leon, you touched on this. I just want to go back. President Cyril Ramaphosa is saying that it's just a matter of time before he signs the National Health Insurance Bill into law. I mean, he was looking for his pen at SONA. How do you think this will be funded considering SA's weak economic growth and even our declining tax base? How are you going to make up for that revenue shortfall as well?
I think there's hardly a way to pay for it from current resources. A number of experts have talked to this, and the amounts are huge. My suspicion is he'll put aside some money for a gradual implementation, maybe some pilot projects, maybe skilling up of staff in specific places, getting ready for implementation. But I don't see any way that he will announce the tax increases needed to properly fund the NHI this year.
And speaking of ratings agencies, I just want to shine a spotlight on that. Looking at government's debt to GDP ratio rising, I mean, we're just looking at some of the most important issues that they're going to be focusing on ahead. What do you think comes to mind on that front as well for our financial year?
I think if we are able to escape the grey list, that will already help a lot, because a lot of that is regulatory. It's not linked to government spending or the financing of the deficit. So that's a step in the right direction, and I think we are getting closer. Then the ratings agencies really want to see whether we'll be able to repay the public debt 10 years from now and 20 years from now. So something like the fiscal rule or the fiscal anchor that's been talked about could be a signal to tell them we're still serious about fiscal consolidation, and we are tying government's hands when it comes to either spending or debt. So both of those, I think, are things that he's going to speak to tomorrow.
It's an election year. There's a high wage bill as well. What are your thoughts on that going forward? We have to factor in unions, workers, the high unemployment rate, just some of the agreements, potential strikes as well. How do we factor all of that in?
I think that really is the toughest part of the story. Last year, he budgeted a very small increase for the public sector wage bill, and in the end had to cave in and give a much bigger increase. What is needed is those sort of famous social compacts that government and its union partners actually agree to inflation or even below inflation increases going forward. But that's something like we saw last year, the minister has limited control over. He can budget, but then other things happen in the background. And it's, I think, one of the biggest concerns for the fiscal stance going forward.
The issue of social grants also coming to the fore. What do you think is going to be considered on that front, given that it is an election year? And as government continues to speak about structural reforms, some are questioning whether there's follow-up implementation as well. How would you weigh in on that as we conclude this chat?
I think it's going to be an interesting difference between what the minister says and what the numbers show.
Yes.
He's really going to play up the important role of grants and the grant system for vulnerable households, but the amounts that he's able to give to top those up are going to be really small. So I think they're here to stay, but the quantum is limited due to the slow growth of the economy. And that's where those structural reforms come in. Unfortunately for the minister, he's involved in most of them, but their progress also depends on the work done in other government departments. So Treasury is at the table, but state-owned enterprises, minerals and energy, all those other ministers and their ministries are also part of implementing reforms, and frequently I think the Minister of Finance is the face for the slow progress, but the slow progress is not his fault.